Digloid.com. Let's walk through an exposure of an oil painting as for exposed to the right capture exposure. This is on my website under Digloid mirrorless cameras. I'm going to go right down to the image. You can get a sense of it. Maybe zoom it down a little bit here. And that's our image. And we've got a wide range of exposures. The camera metered from +0. And then I gave it a whole range of exposures past that. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at. The right exposure is about +1 in brightness, which is different from the capture exposure. So how do you go about assessing that? The first thing you want to do is look at, you've got the camera there and maybe you don't have any other facilities, so you're going to have to do the camera. Where'd my double up one? Okay, so here we go. I talk about this in more detail in another video, but you've got a series of camera histograms, and if you set it to ISO 50, you're going to get a different result than if you set it to ISO 100. These two side by side are exactly the same exposure, and if you look at those, you can see they're both a quarter second at f/5.6, and they're identical, except you got a bright JPEG here and a histogram that looks like it's mashed up against the side. And so what you want to get to is the optimal exposure, which is going to be something like 2 1/3 stops. This is 1 stop, 2 stop, and a third. This is actually, believe it or not, the ideal ETTR exposure for this capture. And yet, if we shoot this at ISO 100, the camera tells us that the histogram is a disaster. It gives us a blinking highlights mess on the image, whereas at ISO 50, we get a good-looking JPEG and a good histogram. How can those two both be true? Well, they're not. Let's look at the RawDigger for this, and that's your tool. RawDigger is an app for your computer, and I put the ideal exposure of +2/3 stops at ISO 100 here up along with the ISO 51, which naturally says +1.3. This is what the camera is showing us, the 150. And if you look at the RawDigger histogram here, we can see that the exposure pushed just up to the right with a little tiny spike. That, as it turns out, is our optimal exposure, and that's the one we'd want to shoot as an ETTR shooter. And what you'll note is that this ISO 50 setting is the one that did it. It gave us a histogram that pretty closely, well, the red and the blue are a little off, but at least it's a lot closer than comparing this RGB here to what we see over here. Compare this RGB, we're a lot closer into range of what we need to do. And when you combine that with the zebra stripes to obtain the exposure in the first place, and then see that this histogram is still in range at ISO 50, you can have a high degree of confidence that you've nailed the exposure. So when we go look at the and if we look at the RawDigger info, we see something similar here. This is not showing blowout except a few tiny red specks in these bright white snow highlights. That's a further confirmation in RawDigger, along with 0.0% overexposure in RawDigger. That tells us that this shot's good. And then finally, you always want to check, is your actual image still the same? And I got to zoom this down a little bit here. Fit it, but basically what we're looking at is the +2 1/3 is this, I'm sorry, +7/3. That's the +2 1/3 stops. And if you watch me go over this, you'll see there's no difference in color and tone between +0 and +7/3. They are identical. Let's just do that with an A-B comparison. A comma B, we'll compare +0 to a raw +0 to raw +7/3. And if I toggle this, can you tell a difference? No. The colors have not shifted. We haven't lost detail or anything like that. So we've been able to give this exposure to this capture 2 1/3 stop more exposure while maintaining color, tonality. Everything's identical. You cannot tell the difference here. If you did a diff on these two images in Photoshop, there's always a little random variation. You'd find there's no difference. So by going with 2 1/3 stops, it's as if the metered one at +0 was shot at ISO 500, but our raw capture, the optimal one, was shot at ISO 100. And ISO 500 versus ISO 100 is a major difference in noise levels. Maybe not too much in the bright highlights, but in the darks it's a very significant issue. And so that's why you'd be using ETTR, so you'll need to use these tools of the histogram and RawDigger to sort that out. And check out ISO 50 and my other video on using that to do that.